What if Yoasobi were a 60s bossa nova group? This week we'll be discussing how a duo with a seemingly niche conceptual take on J-pop managed to become one of Japan's most successful ever musical exports, and also taking a little look at the development of Bossa Nova, a style which similarly escaped the boundaries of its home country to make Brazilian popular music essential listening for 60s hipsters everywhere. All that and more on this week's What If, How and Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. Then on Wednesday I follow it up with one of these companion videos discussing the artists and genres involved in the What If video, and also sharing a little bit of my creative process. So the idea of the What If videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that track and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Yoru ni Kakeru, or Racing Into the Night by Yoasobi. I attempted to transform that into a 1960s bossa nova Latin jazz style track, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Now, like with a lot of things, being a bit old and out of touch, I was pretty slow to catch on to Yoasobi compared to a lot of music fans in the West. I don't have TikTok, I'm not particularly clued up on anime, so by the time I finally heard any music by Yoasobi, they were already extremely well known. I think for me, I only discovered them because I'd got into a bunch of other Japanese pop music over the last few years. I've been checking stuff out on YouTube and the algorithm's gradually suggesting more and more acts I want to check out. And this name Yoasobi kept popping up, and eventually I just clicked out of curiosity, and I think the first thing I saw was a live performance of Idol, which was pretty spectacular. Not necessarily immediately 100% my cup of tea, but definitely really interesting. Interesting enough for me to want to follow up on it. So I think the next thing I then listened to was Racing Into the Night, Yoru ni Kakeru. And the first thing I saw was the official animated music video, which is absolutely spectacular if you ever get the chance to watch that. And that totally hooked me. I just thought it was one of the best things I'd ever heard, so I then had to go and actually find out a little bit more about this act that it turned out loads of people already knew about. So Yoasobi is a duo, a kind of producer-vocalist duo. The producer's a guy called Ayase, and the vocalist is Lila Sikuta, who in Yoasobi goes by the stage name Ikura for some reason. And they both had their own things going on musically. Ayase had initially been in a band called Da Vinci, possibly, but then got really into Vocaloid producing. Now, that's another thing that I only discovered existed recently. The whole Vocaloid scene seems to have largely bypassed Western pop, but as far as I can gather, it's been a really sort of massive thing in the Japanese scene. As I understand it, Vocaloid is basically software that synthesizes the human voice. I think it was quite revolutionary in Japan, just opening doors for amateur producers to produce really high quality sounding stuff at home with just a laptop. So that's kind of the scene that Ayase comes up through, and became pretty popular just sort of making these tracks, sharing them on YouTube. And meanwhile, Lila Sikuta, I think, started out just busking basically. She'd just take to the streets and sing accompanying herself on acoustic guitar before eventually getting picked up by Sony Music for some project they were running, started to gather a little bit of momentum, again sharing stuff on social media, on YouTube, on Instagram. The story of their actual formation as a duo was pretty interesting. I gather in Japan there's a website called Monogatari, which is effectively a social media site for creative writers, so people can interact with other writers and submit their written works to this website. And the guy who ran the site came up with this idea of picking some of the best submissions to the site and using them to create musical works. So he approached ISA to work on this, and ISA agrees to do this, decides he needs a vocalist to work on this with him, and finds Leela Sikuta, I think via Instagram. So they form this duo with the sole purpose of creating songs based on works of fiction, and that's something that's continued to be the basis of their group. I think the slogan they use is novel into music. So all of their music is based on some kind of work of fiction, be it a short story or a novel or a manga or an anime. So the very first song that they released based on a fictional work was Yoro ni Kakeru, which was based on a short story called, I think, The Temptation of Thanatos. I've not managed to find an English translation of the story, but from the synopses of it that I've read, it sounds like it's a pretty dark work. So Ayase, who is, as well as being the producer, is generally the sole composer for Yoasobi, although Ikura does write her own music as well separately. So Ayase takes this dark, haunting, slightly disturbing short story and creates a lyric from it. It's a really interesting lyric in that it reads like a love song and kind of draws you in, but then just gets a little bit more queasily unsettling as it goes along. And he pairs this lyric with this music, which it's a remarkably effective bit of music because it's melancholy but also tremendously upbeat. So it's totally danceable, extremely catchy, but also just kind of haunting. And when you put the whole thing together with Leela Sikuta's kind of plaintive, kind of restrained but still really expressive vocal, it's just a remarkable piece of work. And when I first heard it, I was just completely floored. Kind of sounds really forward-looking in many respects because it's electronica, it's got that sort of driving EDM pulse to it, but there's a real timelessness to it as well. It's drawing from loads of stuff from different eras of pop. There's quite a sort of nostalgic disco and funk thing going on in the rhythm section and the guitars. There's a whole kind of Nile Rodgers guitar thing, but then it's really harmonically rich. There's a complexity and a depth to it that makes it feel like a jazz standard. So it's a really kind of heady mix, and as I say, it just kind of floored me when I heard it. It was understandably a pretty massive debut for them, and they've just kind of gone from strength to strength from that point on, despite having this pretty niche formative idea of only creating songs based on works of fiction. I think the blend of this storytelling style of songwriting with this really quite rich and unique combination of musical ingredients has just totally captured people's imaginations. Helped as well by the fact that the initial brief of writing songs based on fiction allows them to create theme songs for anime shows, and they've been responsible for the themes for a number of extremely popular anime shows. That's really enabled them to just kind of reach out to a much broader audience than your average sort of J-pop act ever gets to. It's a pretty remarkable success story for a duo who have quite an unusual musical makeup and quite a unique creative model as well. Definitely doing some really exciting stuff. But yeah, as I say, one of the first things that I heard in their music when I first listened to that track was the jazziness, especially with the way the piano arrangement's done, almost a Latin jazz feel in places, with the sort of octave runs on the piano, that the sort of thing you hear in quite a lot of Latin jazz, particularly Afro-Cuban style. But on top of that, the vocal delivery of Leela Sikuta immediately put me in mind of Bossa Nova. Just something about that sort of calm, measured tone put me in mind of a Japanese Astrid Gilberto. So I guess that was what prompted me to want to make this particular version of Racing Into the Night. I kind of grew up listening to Bossa Nova music just because my dad was a massive fan of it. He had a bunch of records by Stan Getz and Tom Jobim, Jean Gilberto, and he was also a keen guitarist, so he liked to try and play this stuff at home as well. So I grew up with that happening in the background. Never paid that much attention to it, but it was just always fermenting there. So I've always had this vague understanding of approximately what Bossa Nova sounded like, even if it wasn't something I was especially paying attention to. And then eventually I inherited a bunch of my dad's records, including the Jobim and Getz records. Finally gave them a proper spin and actually listened to them a bit more and started to really appreciate it and understand that there's more going on there than just soothing, easy listening music, which I think is kind of how I always experienced it as a kid. Bossa Nova, which I think basically just translates as the new wave or the new thing, emerged in Brazil around the end of the 50s, kind of as a development from the existing samba scene. I think a lot of people tend to perceive it as a form of jazz, which I gather isn't actually strictly accurate accurate. The waters are muddied because there's always been loads of crossover between bossa nova artists and jazz musicians. I think people hear the rhythmic syncopation and they hear the chord voicings and they assume that that's a jazz influence, but those traits were already developing completely independently in samba in the decades leading up to that, so it's more just a parallel evolution. And then obviously as bossa nova became popular, jazz artists at the time and bossa nova artists started to collaborate and everything gets a bit muddied. Initially often played in a really sparse manner. If you listen to those early João Gilberto records, it's just him and a nylon strung acoustic guitar. His voice is almost a whisper, but it's just beautiful, kind of soft, warm music with this captivating, swaying rhythm to it, and these really rich harmonic voicings as well. I guess the kind of big mainstream crossover point for this new wave of music coming out of Brazil was when, as I say, jazz artists started to pick up on this music. The most notable one being Stan Getz, the American saxophonist, who made a series of records trying to combine his own jazz stylings with this new wave of music coming out of Brazil, and notably the Getz Gilberto album, where he's collaborating with João Gilberto and Tom Jobim, and where we also get to hear Astrid Gilberto for the first time, whose voice, I think, from that point on becomes the main thing that people think of when they think of bossa nova. As far as I can gather, it was almost an accident that she ended up being on that record. They were going to record the song The Girl from Ipanema, and some bright spark had the idea of including some English language translations of the lyrics alongside the original Portuguese just to make it more accessible to English speaking listeners, and Stan Getz wasn't going to sing it and João Gilberto had no intention of attempting to sing in English. His wife at the time, Astrid, just kind of pops up going, well, I could probably sing it in English. And she just turns up with this immaculate, cool, clear vocal delivery that must have contributed so much to making that song the massive success that it was. So that album, with this blend of this Brazilian music and this very cool, accessible strand of American jazz music, actually really revived the commercial fortunes of jazz at that point in the early 60s, because I guess at this point jazz has been struggling commercially against other forms of popular music for a few years, ever since the first influx of rock and roll. But Getz Gilberto provided something new. It was cool enough for the hipsters, but it was also extremely accessible, very melodic. It felt stylish and sophisticated, so it was really appealing to a more adult audience as well. And it's just an amazing combination. They really created something special, and it formed the basis of a much more solid Latin and jazz crossover that continues to this day, as far as I can gather. And that also, I think, crept into mainstream pop music, particularly with the popularity of Astrid Gilberto's vocal parts on the album. Even now, whenever you hear a pop song with that kind of laid-back, sultry Latin American vibe, there's probably some way to trace back its lineage to that album, and probably specifically to that performance of The Girl from Ipanema. But yeah, anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, most stuff is the same, but for the fact that in this universe, the members of Yoasobi were born, I guess, like 55 years earlier. So in this universe, it's 1964, and Ayase is a young pianist and composer who's initially been specifically into jazz, but has recently become clued into this wave of music coming out of Brazil and has got very interested in that, and decides that he'd like to try and bring something like that to Japan, combining those elements with a uniquely Japanese melodic sensibility. So he decides he wants to find a female singer who's going to be like a Japanese equivalent of Astrid Gilberto, so eventually manages to connect with Lila Zakuta, who is just perfect for this, and the two of them start working as a duo around the jazz clubs of Tokyo, building a small but loyal following. But they get their big break when they're approached by the literary editor of the Asahi Shimbun, which I've probably pronounced wrong, but giving it my best go, a leading newspaper in Tokyo, who gets in touch with Ayase and tells them that they've launched a new literary competition. They're asking people to submit short stories for this competition, and part of the prize is that the winning stories are going to be adapted into musical works. And as it turns out, this literary editor is a big fan of Bossa Nova, so he wants the city's leading up-and-coming Bossa Nova duo to be the ones to create these musical adaptations of the stories. So they gladly agree to this, and as the stories start coming in, they start working on these adaptations. The very first one that they complete is Euro ni Kakeru, and with its dark lyrics and its sultry Latin vibe, it immediately becomes a massive hit in Japan, and eventually helps their fame to expand even beyond Japan's borders when an English language translation called Racing into the Night becomes a massive international hit for Rosemary Clooney. So yeah, in attempting to transform Euro ni Kakeru into a Bossa Nova song, the first thing I had to do, as ever, was take the isolated lead vocal, drop it into GarageBand and get it synced up to the grid. The vocal I used was actually from the home take version of the song rather than the original studio version. So this is a rearranged version that Lelis recorded for the First Take YouTube channel, but from her home studio while everyone was in COVID lockdown. Took that, dropped it into GarageBand. I slowed it down a bit because although the song's called Racing into the Night, and it kind of makes sense in that respect to have a high tempo, but Bossa Nova, it needs to be relaxed. So took it down quite a few notches on the BPM. Next thing I did was to pop some drums on there. I'm no expert on Bossa Nova drums, but I had a bit of listen to a few things. Picked a kit that is basically kind of a brushed jazz kit. So it's basically a lot of closed hi-hats, gently brushed ride cymbals, and rim clicks. Found a good Bossa Nova pattern, just making sure I've got the right accents on the rim shots. Used that for the verse, and then inverted the pattern for the chorus, just to add a little bit of variety. Probably in a couple of little fills at strategic points, but nothing too fancy. I didn't want the drums to intrude too much. I also added some percussion, just using GarageBand loops. Added some bongos and congas and maracas, just to add a little bit more rhythmic complexity to what's going on. Next thing was some bass. Back to the old reliable GarageBand studio upright bass sound. Again, nothing too fancy. A lot of the time in Bossa Nova stuff, as far as I can gather, the bass is just doing an alternating first and fifth of the chord, whereas I guess in jazz music you're doing a lot more complex stuff on the bass. Next thing was guitar. Nylon strung guitar is a pretty essential part of the Bossa Nova sound, obviously with a lot of that music starting with João Gilberto playing solo nylon strung stuff, so it tends to still be part of most Bossa Nova ensembles. For that I used my dad's old guitar. This is the guitar that I grew up watching my dad play. It must be a good 60 odd years old now, this thing. So, although I'd seen my dad play Bossa Nova stuff quite a lot, I'd never really had much of a go at it myself. So just had a bit of a listen, trying to pick up some basic idea. Gilberto, when you listen to him, is playing all kinds of different patterns, but I didn't want to try and overstretch myself because I figured I'd just mess it up. So I just tried to latch onto one basic pattern, which is pretty simple, although if you're not used to it, it can be quite tricky to get your head around, just because you've got your fingers playing the chords in a syncopated pattern while your thumb plays the bass notes in an unsyncopated pattern. So you end up with something like... So just figured out that and got to the point where I could do it without messing up too badly. To be authentic, I should have come up with some more elaborate chord voicings, but to be honest, I was just trying to get the rhythm right, so most of my chords aren't too fancy, but it's there underpinning stuff and it gives a bit of that sort of proper feel of a Bossa Nova track. Next thing was piano, which is the bit that took me the most time because I'm not a good pianist and it was a really important thing to try and get right. So just tried to come up with a part that combines some rhythmic vamping with some cool little melodic moments. There's a little instrumental break where the piano takes half of it, and I tried to get just a few proper Latin touches in there too, as I say, the little octave runs and things that you hear in Latin jazz piano styles. And then just to try and go for that Stan Getz ensemble feel, I wanted some sax on there. As I think I've said before in these videos, the GarageBand sax sounds aren't tremendous, but it sounds okay, hopefully, where I've placed it in the mix. And arrangement-wise, I just tried to mix it up so we've got slightly different things happening in each section. So sometimes the drums might drop out, sometimes you're just down to piano, bass and guitar, sometimes the sax comes in and does a bit more. So the makeup of the ensemble changes slightly as we go along. And then for the video, as ever, started out by just finding some good live footage of Yoasobi performing the song. I went for a fan cam just to try and avoid too much copyright nonsense. Popped that into black and white because I wanted to go for a nice kind of 60s period feel. And then I needed a band that looked the part a bit more than Yoasobi's band do. So I thought, well, why not go back to the source? So we've got bits of a Stan Getz performance. We've got Stan himself playing the sax, and we've got his bass player in there too. I've got bits of a Tom Jobim performance. That's the man himself on piano. I think possibly his percussionist that gets in there too. And we've got João Gilberto there on the guitar. So all the big hitters there contributing to this, and just tried to sort of match them up and edit them so it looks a bit like it's all part of one performance. So I hope you enjoyed this one. It did occur to me that this might be a tremendously niche interest thing, but I just really love the song and wanted to do something with it. And I'm really fond of that Bossa Nova sound. As I say, it just reminds me of my dad, which is always a happy thing. So it was really nice to get to revisit that, learn a bit more about it, get to play the old man's guitar on there as well. It just made me feel a bit closer to him, which I thought was really nice. Don't know if it was really nice for anyone else, but it was nice for me. If you did enjoy it, let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you could like, share, subscribe, all that stuff is always tremendously helpful. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any songs or artists or genres you'd like me to investigate, do let me know. I always appreciate suggestions. Otherwise, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will hope to see you next time.